Hey everyone, today we're diving into a deadly King's Indian defense trap. I'll show you a simple but powerful tactic that can completely crush White's center and King's safety. Stick around and learn how to turn this opening into a winning attack. The King's Indian defense arises when Black adopts a kingside fianchetto setup against White's common opening structures with moves such as a pawn advancing to d4 or c4, or when White develops the knight to f3. For instance, in a typical opening sequence, White often advances the pawn to a 4 to claim space and influence in the center. Black replies with pawn to d6, strengthening central control and preparing the characteristic structure of the King's Indian defense. White continues developing pieces, but a frequent mistake at this stage is placing the bishop on d3. At first glance, this move looks natural and active, yet it actually contains a strategic flaw. To understand the issue, it is important to recognize the main strategic ideas behind the King's Indian defense. One of Black's primary plans is to put strong pressure on White's pawn on d4, using the long diagonal of the fianchettoed bishop on g7. Black can increase this pressure by developing the queen's knight to c6. In addition, the bishop can be developed to g4, pinning the knight on f3 and reducing White's ability to defend the central pawn. Sometimes Black can also challenge the center directly with the pawn break pawn to e5. As you can see, Black has several ways to increase the pressure on the d4 pawn. When White places the bishop on d3, it blocks the queen on d1, making it harder for White to defend the pawn on d4. Because of this interference, the move becomes a positional mistake. Black continues with the natural plan by developing the bishop to g4, aiming to exchange it for the knight on f3, which is one of the main defenders of the center. White may try to question the bishop with pawn to h3. Black captures the knight on f3 with the bishop, White recaptures, and Black then develops the queen's knight to c6, increasing the pressure on d4. This is one of the simplest and most effective strategic ideas in the King's Indian defense. Now White must decide how to react. In many cases, White tries to reinforce the center. At the right moment, Black can also jump the knight to a5, creating a fork that attacks both the queen and the bishop. Another powerful option is placing a knight on d4, an excellent central square, which can later be supported by a pawn. White often tries to stabilize the position by developing the bishop to e3. Black responds by moving the knight to d7, which opens the diagonal for the bishop and again increases pressure on the pawn on d4. If White continues defending, Black has a tactical opportunity by jumping the knight to a5, forking the queen and the bishop. At first it may appear that Black is sacrificing a piece, but if White captures the knight, Black can repeat the same fork idea. After the queen moves, Black can play knight takes bishop on d3, gaining a decisive advantage, capturing a pawn and creating further threats. Moves like pawn to c5 and queen to a5 check make the position extremely favorable for Black. Returning to the main line of the King's Indian defense, placing the bishop on d3 is inaccurate, while the more correct move is bishop to e2. Nevertheless, Black's plan remains similar. Develop the bishop to g4 to exchange the knight on f3. After White castles kingside, Black can play the flexible move knight to d7. This is not the main theoretical line, but it keeps the plan simple, continuing pressure on the pawn on d4. Eventually, White often plays pawn to h3. Black is happy to capture the knight on f3 because that was the original idea. After the exchange, Black develops the queen's knight to c6, attacking the d4 pawn for the second time. White must react. If White defends with the queen, it becomes slightly harder for Black to apply immediate pressure. However, Black can strike in the center with pawn to e5, gaining control of important central squares. If White advances in the center, Black can place the knight on d4, penetrating deep into White's position and controlling many key squares. To support this powerful knight, Black may later advance the pawn to c5. If White captures, Black obtains a dangerous passed pawn on d4, forcing White's knight to retreat while also opening the diagonal for the bishop. Black can then defend the pawn with queen to f6, maintaining a very strong position. Another tricky idea is advancing the pawn to d3, opening the diagonal for the bishop. If White captures this pawn, Black can play bishop takes pawn on b2, attacking the rook on a1. White might believe they have outplayed Black by forcing the bishop away and then capturing the pawn on b7. However, this is actually a trap. Black plays knight to c5, creating a fork against the queen and the rook, winning material and likely the game. Even if White avoids this trap, Black still enjoys an excellent position thanks to the powerful bishop and a very strong knight on c5. But what happens if White is an experienced player who understands this plan and carefully reinforces the pawn on d4? That is where the next strategic ideas of the King's Indian defense come into play. White often begins with pawn to h3, aiming to stop black from developing the bishop to g4 and pinning the knight on f3. After that, white usually places the bishop on e3, supporting the central pawn on d4 and solidifying control over the center. Next, white develops the knight to f3, believing that the center is now stable and well defended. This setup looks solid, but it gives black opportunities to challenge the center and create tactical chances. Black responds energetically with pawn to e5, directly challenging white's central control. If white allows a capture, it opens the diagonal for black's fianchettoed bishop on g7 and activates the rook along the e-file. White frequently pushes pawn from d4 to d5, expecting black's knight on f6 to retreat. Instead, black jumps knight to d4, which may look risky because it seems white could win a pawn. However, black has the tactical idea knight takes pawn on c4, taking advantage of white's slow development and slightly exposed king. Next, after knight takes pawn on a4, black plays queen to h4, creating pressure along the fourth rank and the e-file. White's bishop on d4 is attacked multiple times, and black is ready to win material. If white tries to exchange pieces, black inserts an intermediate check, gaining a tempo and winning the knight. Even if white defends with the bishop and hopes to castle, black has the tactical threat queen takes pawn on g2, attacking the rook on h1. This puts white in a very difficult position. We can capture the rook with check, forcing white to respond immediately. If they try to defend the rook, we can then calmly recapture the bishop, leaving white's position completely disorganized and vulnerable. Additionally, if white decides to capture our knight, we have the powerful follow-up queen to h4, creating threats along the fourth rank and increasing pressure on white's king and pieces. If white captures the pawn on g7 with the bishop, black calmly plays rook to e8, setting up a discovered check. If the bishop moves, knight takes pawn on c3 attacks the queen and checks the king, often winning decisive material. White may try a quieter move like bishop to a2, but black can capture the bishop on e3, completely breaking white's central pawn structure while activating all pieces. Even if white plays queen to d4, black can block, force trades, and maintain a dominant position. You're also threatening to break apart white's pawn structure. If white decides to trade pawns, it's not an issue. Your rook remains active and your pieces continue to apply pressure. Even if the position is roughly equal, you're the one creating threats, while your king stays safe and ready for potential endgame opportunities. The plan now is to develop the bishop to d7 and place the rook on e8, completing a solid and powerful setup. In some games, white chooses the Ziskin variation, advancing pawn to f3 followed by bishop to e3, solidifying the center and preparing a kingside expansion. Black can respond with pawn to e5, and if white closes the center, pawn to a5 stops white's queenside expansion and secures the key c5 square for the knight, giving black strong long-term control. If white plays queen to d2, black can consider repositioning the knight to a6, preparing to occupy a more active square like c5 or b4. White may respond with bishop to h6, aiming to exchange black's key defender of the king, and follow up by pushing pawn to h4 and then h5, launching a kingside attack reminiscent of the dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. This can be very dangerous if black is unprepared, but there is a tactical idea that often catches opponents off guard. The surprising move is knight takes c4, sacrificing the knight on an apparently well-defended square. If white captures, black plays queen to h4, simultaneously threatening the king and the bishop on h6. On the next move, black can capture the bishop, gaining a clear material and positional advantage. Although white's bishop on h6 looks strong, black can respond with pawn to f5, driving back the knight and taking control of the center. From there, the knight can be maneuvered to c5 or b4, solidifying black's superior position while coordinating with other pieces to dominate both the center and the flanks.